form to it yet because of the speaking over in the last hour, on last hour and a half. But what we're going to try to do is get as far as we can with the rest of section 12, and then we'll probably roll the next lecture into the next class. I am running out of time, so I've got to make some time somewhere. I want to do a recap, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but we have to put things back into context for our ability to go forward. So if you remember, in chapter 10 and 11 of Genesis, what we find is the foundation of government here and the structure that began to take place. The first collective government was family-based. Secondly, there was this universal problem of idolatry. And it's important that idolatry was found in every culture, including the Semitic ones. And the Jews had to be miraculously delivered from it, which God did to Abraham. And so what we have is, after the flood, and of course specifically in keeping with the Tower of Babel, God divided mankind by the three sons of Noah according to their tongues, families, nations, and lands. And those four terms are taken strictly right out of the text itself, but it's important for us to understand those are God's division points. So when he divided the earth, he did it, the sovereign work of God. He did it by using tongues to manipulate family groups. And out of those family groups came the new nations that were spread all over the earth. And the spreading resulted in nations settling in certain lands and occupying those lands. And so that's the subsequent picture. I would like to make a mention here of the 400th anniversary of the settling of America by the English at Jamestown, which is this summer. This is the 400th anniversary. And it's interesting that the settling of America and the Americas occurred primarily because the lands were unsettled. There were Indian tribes that roamed nomadically across the country, but they did not operate in terms of the ownership of lands, nor did they fill the land or fill the earth, as it were. And so with the European Western Christian mindset, looking for lands, looking for places of freedom, the colonization of unoccupied lands, that's exactly what the West considered the American continent. And so obviously the two different world views collided with the manner in which land was possessed, and eventually through much inappropriate activity, to be certain, the Indians were displaced off of the land by the Western nations. Another quick recap here. Whoops. Remember that God confused the languages of men to restrain rebellion. Again, never lose sight of that track in the history. It's the inability of man to do anything but corrupt himself when he has the liberty and the strength and the knowledge to do it. And the new languages were what God used to change everything. And by the dividing of families into smaller units, we did have this capability, God had this capability, to concentrate the gene pool of people. And so all of the races occurred or appeared on the earth after the Tower of Babel. But by isolating gene pools geographically from each other, you ended up with the concentration of certain characteristics and the domination of those characteristics within the various tribes that we've seen over the various races we've seen on the face of the earth. Again, a recap here. What did God restrain by the judgment, the Tower of Babel? Because unity of using technology for idolatrous purposes, men had once again corrupted their ways. God restrained perfect unity, because unity, when used to rebel, has a perfection of rebellion that man cannot be rescued or delivered from, because the imagination, the use of the imagination, that's unrestrained for evil purposes. God confused and diluted the use of imagination, collective imagination. The emotional antagonism restrains man. The happy unity also creates emotional comfort, and that was just disrupted, again, to prevent this terror of man's own sin ruining his life. And the disconnected technology. Man has the ability to be perfectly the solver of all his problems, he becomes perfectly careless of those problems. You might best, this might be best be illustrated here today with just the nature of certain kinds of diseases. There are diseases that are accompanied, that accompany certain kinds of sinful behavior, and it's exclusively diseases that can only be transferred by that kind of inappropriate behavior. And what man does, instead of fixing his behavior, he tries to find drugs and cures to take away the consequence of that illicit behavior. And that's the natural abuse of technology. So what God did was he scattered men and divided man's collective educational, emotional, and imaginative capability, so that by disrupting the unity of man, he could prevent man from literally being unreachable. This is God speaking, so in God's view, all of the effort and the work that he had purposed in Christ by his mercy and by his long-suffering, which we heard of in the last hour, all of that was not going to be capable of disrupting man from his sin if man was granted the license to solve his own problems, as it were, on the earth. But it also speaks to the fact that the problems on the earth are, have potential solution that isn't godly, and God is trying to keep us from that. So God's goal for history then is not to advance civilized men, but to advance the gospel to all men. Now, starting with Abraham, going this first little segment of, we're in the period of Abraham to David now, no brief discussion, and what we'd like to do here is cover the 4 groups that I have there listed, and I'm going to cover it this way. We're going to do a little bit of background with each group. I'll give you a little bit of dating and other interesting issues, and interesting facts to kind of give you a point of reference, and you might use that dating, and by the way, to plug into your timeline of history as you're completing your timeline. We're going to talk about some of the issues that are available, each of these little subsets, some of the concepts of government or history that arise out of that, and also we'll be focusing on the problem. And we're going to limit ourselves. We're going to always focus on the problem of unrighteousness, since that's the big theme of history, God resolving unrighteousness of man by redemption. So beginning here with that background, for Abraham to Jacob, all the nations were developed along family lines, and Genesis chapters 1 to 11 covers from 4004 BC, or if you're using the original terminology, Anno Mundi AM 01, to 1920 BC, or 2076 AM. So basically, if you look at the spectrum of history, Becca, time out. Could you stop a second? So the first 11 chapters of Genesis cover over 2,000 years, and essentially the book of the whole New Testament covers, in terms of historical span all the way through Revelation, covers approximately 2,000 years. So it's an interesting picture that there was a tremendous concentration of essential basic information, but certainly in 11 chapters of Genesis, you're not going to get an enormous amount of detail. So it doesn't really begin until about chapter 10 and 11 of Genesis that we begin having recorded history anywhere else in terms of Nimrod and some of the records from the cradle of civilization, as they call it, which is that place from which all nations scattered, the Tower of Babel. So when you begin at chapter 12 of Genesis, you're starting somewhere in the neighborhood around 1920 BC, and if you use AD as the rough reference to the year of our Lord, you can see that from Genesis 12 all the way to Malachi is going to be around 2,000 years. So Abraham is the father of all righteous families and nations. We spent this morning's hour and a half going over that from a large, big biblical picture. Genesis 12 begins the story. Abraham is a descendant of Shem. His family was dwelling in Ur of the Chaldees, in Babylonia, at his birth. And they traveled to Haran when he was 75, which is also Nahor of Mesopotamia. And an important little reference here for Scripture's sake is referred to as between the two rivers, and Joshua refers to this area as over the river, in terms of where Abraham came from. The calling of Abraham begins the calling out from the nations of God's own people. And we didn't mention this in the last hour, but this is a simple fact, and that is when God is collecting his people to himself, he's collecting them out of their idolatry, out of their heritage, out of their natural place of residence and affection, and he calls them to himself. And so if you want to just tuck a little note in here for scriptural reference, Hebrews chapter 12 speaks of all of the families of Abraham in this fashion. They were pilgrims who were sojourning or who were wandering. They had no fixed dwelling place. And the scripture says they looked for the city whose builder and maker was God. So there's a significant aspect to the manner in which Abraham was brought out from his family and from his kindred and tribe to God and God's own purposes that marks the work of God in every generation as he calls people to himself as a part of his family. Abraham's family served other gods in Haran, and we'll look at that in another minute as well. But again, the emphasis is to recognize left to himself, man's an idolater with no hope. And there's no history of man that's ever without idolatry, except God himself intervenes and intercepts man in his history, with which we see the story of Abraham is that interception. Did Abraham worship idols? The scripture doesn't say that Abraham himself worshipped idols, but reading here from Joshua 24:2, Joshua said unto the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the river in old time." Okay, this is again giving reference back to the other side of the Euphrates River, where Babylon was. Even Terah, father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, they served other gods. Now, plural pronoun, they served other gods, referring to the fathers, doesn't necessarily mean Abraham per se. We do know from what we read earlier in Romans that God is capable of preventing someone from worshiping idols by his sovereign grace. And so if it was God's purpose and intention to deal with Abraham, one who was not an idolater, then his rescue of Abraham and his prevention of serving idols to Abraham would have been a work of his grace. But the Bible doesn't say one way or the other. We would be wrong to assume that Abraham was an idolater, but it would be just as inappropriate to assume that he wasn't. He was called out of Haran when he was 75 years old, and so there's a possibility that, especially even as a child, that he was a part of that idolatrous practice in his home. But while the scripture doesn't declare it for Abraham per se, his family certainly was. So we got the picture. There's really no one righteous. There's none that seeketh after God. We're altogether led away by vanity. Okay, now we're going to get into a really important discussion, and this is going to be an overview taken from Dr. Paul Jaley's tapes. He has two specific tapes which are done superbly on the idea of the law of nations. This is primarily being taken from the last 10 minutes of the first tape. So it's a kind of a concentrated summary. But what I want to do in this particular presentation is just introduce the whole idea of the law of nations as it relates to some biblical reference points. So we're in the area of some of this issues of interest. And what I want to comment here, just think for a moment that most distinctive disruption of history that occurred at the Tower of Babel, when all the families of the earth were hunkered down in one geographic set place around Babel. They were determined to stay there and make a name for themselves and refused to obey the ordinance of God to fill and spread the earth. And at that place, God disturbed language and broke the tribes and the families apart by giving them different languages. Now, there's no knowledge specifically what language they spoke before God divided their tongues. Some have said, well, since Hebrew was the language of God's chosen people, Hebrew was what everybody spoke before the Tower of Babel. Well, that's a nice inference, and there's lots of reasons to imagine and consider the possibility, and certainly we can't say that it's not true. But it is interesting in the Hebrew, though, to take a look at some words and how they relate. One of the interesting studies of history is studying the formation of language and the formation of words, and you form one word from another word. And I find here real interesting that there's a link between the root word for family, daughter, language, and judgment. And it's an interesting, the basic root word is the same. So this link demonstrates the demonstration of, the development of families as nations from the time of the confusion of languages, and I'll kind of walk you through that here real quickly. First of all, the word translated for custom and family both have a common root, which is the root for the word used for judgment. This root is also used for the word daughter and language. Now, I'd like to stand out because you say, well, what does judgment mean? And judgment is one of those terms that appears so many times in the Bible, but it has so many shades of meaning in very, very determined application. And so one of the things when you begin to see the root word for judgment relates to other words like custom and family, there's a little picture that begins to form. When you're making a judgment, let's say I have an apple and an orange on the table, and I'm asking you to discern between them to make a judgment. What you're going to do is find the distinctions. You're going to separate the orange from the apple based on certain kinds of distinctions. So you're going to be passing a judgment. So basically, judgment then has the implication of looking at something and noticing the distinctions, that which stands out, that which causes something to be different or separate. And so judgment would be the practice of articulating, noting distinctions. Well, at the same time, when you have a family, based on the scriptural analysis that families were given separation papers through giving them a specific tongue, then they were put into different geographical locations, and then those dynamic traits of their races developed. What you find with family then is one of the key attributes to the concept of family is distinction. Family A and family B have distinctions. There's that which rises between them that are the differences, and again, that's the picture of judgment. So it's not surprising to me at all that the word for family is rooted back in the idea of distinction, because that's how God divided the earth. He made distinction among all the families of the earth, and that distinction is what He caused to separate. So you see that the simple idea at the root of that word for judgment begins to colorfully influence the understanding of language. And a family is a distinct group of people with notable characteristics that are different from others, and so that sense of distinction comes out of it. And then also at the same time, the idea of custom. Families secluded and separated, functioning and caring for one another, etc., according to their needs and their creative genius, etc. The customs begin to be distinctive. And so, again, the word for custom is, again, simply a word that comes along and primarily means from the Hebrew origin, that which the distinct practices of a group of people are different from another group of people. So, to me, it's extremely interesting to see that from the Tower of Babel, where you actually have the development of families and customs, and the whole concept of language originates there. Again, the word language, the root for the word language is the same word for judgment. And again, it really has the idea of distinction. Latin is very distinct from Greek. I'm sure there might be similarities and overlaps and what have you, but again, it's the peculiarity of the distinction that mark them, as the word judgment would imply. This is this and that's the other. In fact, when you do any language study, that's the basis for a lot of the language study. The distinctness of Greek, for example, versus Latin or some other language finds itself in the root words. You know, this comes from a Latin origin. Well, we know it's from a Latin origin because of the distinct nature of a Latin word. You can find a Latin word lying around and trace it back to its origin because of its distinction. So I find it interesting that God divided the earth and He made distinctions among men, and that that word for language and dividing and creating families and creating the customs of man, that word is just a modified little version of itself. And then you think, well, what in the world does daughter have to do with it? And I think that it's interesting that the word daughter and language are related somewhat because of what the word daughter means. I think I have another panel on it, so I'll reserve it for that. But basically, a daughter is that which helps an individual man becomes a distinct family unit. The Bible says that when you join a husband to his wife, they two become one flesh. And it's the creation of a family unit that makes a family distinct, makes a man distinct. And so a daughter, the word for daughter simply means she who causes a man to be distinct. And so basically man gains his heritage by the wife that God gives him. And so a daughter is the enabler of distinction, to play on the words in a simple way. Now the primitive root for all these words is shepheth, which means to stand out like a banner on high. Can be used for all kinds of things. Anything that causes distinction, something to stand out, something that becomes a fixed objective and focus point. And so it's interesting that the word cheese comes from the same idea of distinction. Now, if you think of it, if you've ever made cheese, the process of making cheese means you add something to the milk that causes the solid to be distinct from the liquid. It stands out, and so that whole concept of distinction and judgment, it helps you begin to understand the color of the word judgment, because that word judgment, which is used 203 times, has that shade primarily of to give proper distinction in its proper setting. So even cheese is distinct from, it's causing the solids to be distinct from the fluids in milk. Now, other translations from this word means lip, language, and speech. That's interesting to me. What is the lip? It's the physical feature that causes language to be distinct, that causes family to be distinct, that causes customs to be distinct, causes a nation to be distinct. So it's interesting that it goes back to that same basic root. Also on your face, a lip is one of the two distinct features that stand out and make and give your facial appearance some significance. Point 6, this is an interesting relationship when considering God uses different languages to create distinctions between families. Languages used to define distinctions between families that become nations. So it's just a little summary point. Daughter here is the same. I mentioned that a minute ago. Comes from a similar root word, which means to spread out. As a possible connotation, daughter is the means by which the distinction of a husband can spread out upon the earth, not only to form nations, but just to form a distinct family. I love that verse in Genesis 2. When the wife is taken by the husband, the two become one, and that distinct unit is such that God says, let no man put us under. Let no man break that distinction that's been formed by that union. 6, the idea of judgment means customs that are distinct and stand out from any family or nation. And again, that word shepheth, which is the root of judgment, is also the root here we're talking about. Continuing here, let me try to speed up the listing for the discussion. First of all, that word for judgment, shepheth, occurs 203 times, and basically is the idea of making a distinction between two matters or parties or issues or what have you. Though you're not, and I'm not familiar with the Hebrew per se, mishpat is a compound word off that root, and it means judgment, and that occurs 421 times. So the word judgment, and its basic root word, and its compound root, occurs some 627 times, and it again though has an expanded meaning that have generally significance about custom, ordinance, fashions, and it always has some implication of measuring against a distinct standard recognized or agreed to within a distinct family, nation, or what have you. So it's really helpful to understand that what God did at the Tower of Babel was so influenced man that the distinctions God wanted to secure and make to preserve people for his own salvation is remarkable. And the whole manner in which at least the Hebrew language developed from that point centered around the understanding that these distinctions God was making, there's almost a sense of harmony. As I walk within the understanding of that distinction, those distinctions that God's making, I'm walking in harmony with the judgments of God. And I'm discerning differences, I'm discerning commonality. And there's a sense of capability of walking in harmony. That the command to love judgment, to walk in judgment, is one of the most repeated commands of the Old Testament. Point 11, this idea is significant because it points to the family nation as the highest distinctive group from which unique ordinances, customs, and manners of govern life. Again, we're starting now to get towards a summary point of objective. What we find is God made distinctions at the family level, and it's those families that became nations when placed in distinct lands, became unique races, etc. But the important thing we begin to understand then is that unity also implies that the highest form of government over any group of people is the government of that collective people in a family. And so what we imply here is that there's no such thing, because of God's judgment on misappropriated unity, there is no such thing as a world government to which every family or every nation of the earth gives allegiance to. The distinct and different families that God ordered and ordained is the basis for judgment, and those distinctions of customs and practice, etc., are those things that God ordained and brought about from those individuals. So that when we find ourselves even with the thought and the concept of evangelization and spreading the gospel, it begins to be important and imperative to recognize that evangelization of the gospel would never ever imply that you would take the gospel and then by the culture of the people preaching the gospel, enter into a different culture and conform the new culture to the culture of the preachers of the gospel. That is totally inappropriate manifestation of preaching the gospel. You preach Christ, you preach Him crucified, and Christ transforms the nations, but He retains their tongues and their languages and those distinctions. It's interesting to know, especially in the history of China, that the struggle with missionaries coming in from the West, from every area of life, with different little nuances, and then also carrying forth the Western culture and civilization into the Chinese culture. A great deal of confusion with the gospel and a great deal of resistance to the gospel eventually occurred because of the confusion that, because Westerners were preaching the gospel, then Western ideals and Western practices were what the whole world needed to follow. We need the universal gospel, but not a universal law of nations that everyone is to adhere to. So comment 12 here then brings up a terminology which is important to the study of history, especially in the Western civilization. The phrase was coined in the time of the Reformation, especially law of nations. The recognizing and understanding of national sovereignty among nations and how that springs from God's purposes in the Bible and works itself out. Essentially, we'll talk a great deal about the law of nations, so I'm going to move on here. Abram sets the first standards for just war. He also illustrates that this golden rule is to be the primary standard for the law of nations. And essentially then the law of nations is defined as the boundary between two sovereign entities or nations, whereby the rights of one nation may not be infringed upon by the other. While there's a necessity for one nation to honor the other, the autonomy of another nation, and it provides no recourse to impose outside interference except to resolve one's interests. Now this is a pretty important concept, but what's important is to realize this. God founded the nations in Genesis 11, and as the Roman Empire collapsed and Christian thought through careful study of the Bible occurred, which happened in a significant manner from 100 AD to 300 AD especially, careful consideration and understandings of what was the foundation of a relationship between nations came forth. And this term law of nations has been one of the most influential parts of Western civilization. A little sidebar here, which again, if you listen to Paul Jaley's lectures, you'll get the fullness of it. In one of his lectures, he has this application of this principle to American history. And the law of nations is the most significant part of the American foreign policy through the early 20th century. It's an amazing history of how America deliberately placed itself among the nations of the earth, specifically with the respect to its own rights to exist, and also to respect the existence of other nations. So there's this, and it's an interesting thing. This is really a Christian concept because it comes from the Bible, and the Christian heritage is that continuance of the history of God upon the earth. But it can be said that in terms of impact, even with the United Nations as potentially dangerous as it is, as a form of common treaty forming among nations, one of the benefits of the United Nations is that it is built upon the structure, that the basic Christian heritage, though imperfectly, that acknowledges the individual autonomy and authority of each nation and the necessity of all nations to honor smaller nations in such a fashion so that if a big bully comes along to squash a nation, there's an obligation of other nations to step in and preserve that autonomy from one nation to another. That would be a little bit of an illustration of what the United States did when we delivered Kuwait from Iraq in the first Gulf War. Again, these points on law of nations are all coming directly out of the notes I took from Dr. Jaley's tapes on the law of nations. Now, we see several things. I'm going to talk more detail about the issues of the law of nations and things relating to it. But getting back to Abraham, we find the first international treaty, as it were. You say international, I mean, that was just Abraham there on the plains with those guys nearby. Well, see, international simply means between nations. Doesn't matter. It didn't say intercontinental. It's international. So Abraham and Lot sort of illustrate that necessity, the separation of Lot from Abraham's family, and the necessity of a treaty to govern that. Basically, that illustrates the superior law of nations. A nation is a sovereign entity that has the right and the ability to enter into a treaty. A treaty is the binding between two sovereign entities upon themselves, a mutual agreement affecting both of their interests. Often it's done to preserve their rights for fear of somebody overstepping. There are a couple other illustrations of treaties from the smallness of buying Sarah's tomb, the purchase of that tomb, though it might just seem like property rights, is really a picture of honoring one nation versus another. Isaac and Abimelech, they had a treaty between them where Abimelech was concerned that Isaac was going to overrun his country. And then Jacob and Laban, again, a similar treaty trying to protect their interests. But the origin of treaties begins in the book of Genesis with Abraham and his family. Also, Abraham illustrates a concept of just war, and we're going to again go into some of these details a little bit more substantively. But the idea of a just war, when do you pick up arms to defend your cause? And there's an aspect to which the duty of a nation to protect and preserve its sovereign interests is much different than the duty of an individual to protect and preserve its own interests. The duties of an individual are always subjugated to the governing system that God has ordained over them. And for example, men are commanded not to murder, not to take the life of other men. Nations are commanded to impose capital punishment against those who do commit murder. So we see that's the understanding of the duty of a nation to resolve matters, even with a sense of force being involved. In this case with Lot delivered his own brother-in-law, Sodom, and he has demonstrated that a just war is a military action by which a sovereign nation recovers its right taken or threatened to be taken by another sovereign. And treaties may cause obligations to participate in another's war, like Abraham for Lot and consequently for the king of Sodom. So up here when we talked about treaty, you think that, well, Abraham and Lot didn't have much of a treaty, but there was a common interest between them, and the interests of Lot became jeopardized, and Abraham delivered Lot. Now, these other 5 kings that Abraham also delivered happened to be in league with Abraham only because of his interest with Lot. And so there you see the nature of a just war. Abraham was just because he had personal interests and he made a league of others who had a common interest. but that's a pretty good foundation for this whole concept of what a treaty is and the nature of a just war and how somebody ends up getting involved in a just war. Now, there's another point here. The law of nations is the golden rule. And again, I'm taking this pretty much right out of the lecture from Dr. Jaley. But based on the truth of Christ's teaching, the law of nations is pretty much the same for how individuals treat each other. In other words, an individual is a sovereign individual person that has a duty to obey God and the right to express his gifts and talents and skills within the fashion in which his inheritance and his opportunities afford him, of course, within the keepings of the law of his nation. But the reality is, Jesus said to one another, you love God, and then you love your neighbor as yourself. And so there's that aspect of you do unto others what you would have others do unto you. That applies to individuals, applies also to individual nations. And this was, again, the argument coming out of the Reformation to understand this basic structure of how nations get along, what they do and what they don't do. It's interesting that this doctrine of the law of nations has been the most influential idea in Western civilization as it relates to national policies. However, it's the only idea that it's never been codified. Nobody adopted it as a rule. The United States has worked it out into their foreign policy because of its fundamental rightness, but it's never been considered. For example, the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson basically described, we have a right to take our seat at the table by the law of nations, to have a full and sovereign and equitable position among all the nations of the earth. And again, we appealed to the law of nations, though it doesn't exist per se as any fundamental law per se. It's a universal law of God's purpose that we have, that nations have functioned by really since Genesis chapter 11. So according to the reformers, in trying to summarize the law of nations simply, they basically have three elements of the law of nations, and we'll cover these in a little bit of detail here. The law of natural equality or independence, the law of benevolence and kindness, and the law of fidelity of engagement. Those three laws are the fundamental parts of the law of nations, and we'll start with the law of natural equality or independence. Essentially, the law of natural equality or independence means that each nation has the right to be independent from each other, so that you're not obligated to be subservient to another nation in terms of God's divine right in establishing nations. Again, the Tower of Babel forbade man to band together in unity. The correction for banding together in unity, all nations together, was to disperse all nations separately, and so that aspect of independence is the fundamental law of nations. Three things spring out of this. Number one, we're not obligated. Liberty is derived from nature, and nature is God. That is the law established by God in nature, that there is no higher ordained power over a sovereign nation than God himself. No nation is ever obligated to another nation by virtue of some nation's declaration or superiority to them. You might obligate yourself by a treaty, but there's no natural overriding law of obligation where a nation has to obey another nation. We can't go to our neighbor in Canada and said, you had better establish these rules and live by these rules or we're going to crush you. That is not a part of the doctrine of the law of nations. That would be tyranny. That would be imposing our will against another sovereign nation. The second point here is that we're not interdependent. That's pretty important because we must be able to assert and maintain one's own right without a weak dependence on another sovereign. Now, you'll really need to listen to Dr. Jaley's tape to get the fullness of that, especially as it relates to American history and the history of the Western Hemisphere. But real simply, it's an element to which it affords a discussion. When does a nation derive its national status? At what time does a nation derive its national status? When you look back in the book of Genesis, it seems like this little family here goes off into this geographical area, and before you know it, they're a nation. And it starts up maybe with the city. You establish a city, and you get these little city-states, and the national entity is built around that kind of recognition. That's pretty much the slow and natural development of it, and it's true. But The significant element then would be in the various stages of growth of a nation, there are times when you would be a very weak and disaffected nation, and where you would be more dominant or capable type of nation. And so just looking at Abraham himself, when he left and he was fighting the battle against the kings who stole Lot and invaded Sodom and Gomorrah, etc., the Bible says he had 400 armed men. So that's a pretty small group of people, pretty small army. And the Bible also said that at the exact time, he didn't really, I forget the exact time, but I'm not sure that Isaac had even been born yet. But the picture is God allowed distinctness to rest on Abraham from God's purpose, but that distinction was afforded to him. But there were the battles that went on among those people who were already dwelling and living in the land. And it was actually in due time that God took this fledgling nation, deposited them in Egypt for 400 years, and essentially the nation of Israel didn't really sit among the sovereign nations of the world until after they departed from Egypt and entered into the promised land some 400 years later. So it's a significant case where we find a nation is a nation when it's able to have a reasonable assertion of its rights, and it's not entirely dependent upon another sovereign to support it and to protect it, etc. And then thirdly, concerning the law of equality and not interfering, this is a pretty important quote from one of the reformers that said, "Though the actions of one nation are condemned by the law of conscience, other nations are obliged to bear with them when their actions do not injure their own perfect right or obligation." That's also called the proper jurisdiction to engage. In other words, when you have a sovereign nation, it's not the duty of any one nation to look over their shoulder to another nation and say, "Oh, I don't like what you're doing. You shouldn't do that." There has to be this restrained understanding that my right to interfere in somebody else's affairs has to be restricted to when my affairs are being interfered with. Now, when I was young, I used to always wonder what they meant when I would listen to TV and hear the presidents talk about our national interests and use that phrase as a basis for discussing some war or battle or whatever we were doing abroad in the international theater. And understanding this concept of the law of nations, basically a nation has to give an answer, not only to its own people, but to the, as it were, the court of the rest of the sovereign nations, to how their actions are justifiable because they're taking and resolving their own interests in those arenas. And so we have quite a complicated world politic at this point in time, and much of the complication is the fact that we have widespread interests, but sometimes the question is, just because an interest is widespread, does it mean that it is valid? In other words, are we imposing by interfering, or are we legitimately dealing with our perfect right or obligation? Now, the second law is the law of benevolence and kindness, and three things spring out of it: the golden rule, and the nature of autonomy, and the nature of neutrality. Under the golden rule thing, basically, the law of benevolence says you treat others as you would like others to treat yourself. And again, what it means is not, you don't treat others as they treated you. And one of the marvels of Western civilization and one of the marvels of American history is how we treat our enemies, though they have treated us deplorably. Maybe the most recent study of significance might be a study of World War II, when the atrocities committed against our troops by the Japanese were so egregious. And yet, in the final ultimate victory of our troops over Japan, our treatment of Japan was with respect, was according to the law of nations, and we treated them as we wished that we would be treated. You probably hear often the Geneva Conference and the concepts from the Geneva Conference. Well, the Geneva Conference is probably one of the first documents that have tried to structure how to conduct war among nations, sort of as a court of war between the nations, with respects to not only discussing the lawful rights of individual nations per se, but also the manner of judgment when a nation has violated autonomy or respect for other nations in an illegal fashion. Point B here, though, is an important point because it talks about autonomy, and basically it means this: if I'm going to be kind and benevolent, if I'm going to be helpful to another nation, it might be the same as if I'm going to be helpful to another family, that contribution to the happiness of others must always begin with oneself, so that when I'm providing for others' needs, I'm not going to jeopardize the ability that I have to care for myself. That is upheld strongly in Scripture when Paul introduces the whole concept of grace giving in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. But the concept there of grace giving centers around what Paul said is, I give according to what I have, not according to what I don't have. And so I don't jeopardize, I don't peril my own ability to keep my first and primary obligations. There's another verse that Paul teaches, if you don't take care of your own house, you're worse than an infidel. And so with respects to nations, I'm limited. I do not care for another nation's interests above caring for the national interests of my own people. And then thirdly here, letter C, the idea of neutrality, which is singling on the concept of not meddling. And neutrality really means to not impose the manner of government and the internal practices of that government that are familiar to ourselves upon another. I don't dictate how a government ought to live or work or function. And I don't meddle in another's affairs. And the third law here of the law of nations is the law of fidelity of engagement. This is basically a law governing treaties. With this law, we have 4 subpoints. Number 1, the whole concept of a conventional treaty. What a conventional treaty is, the only international law above a sovereign nation. But it's a law that the nation imposes upon itself by a voluntary treaty with another sovereign nation. Interesting how Hitler attempted to abuse this concept of a voluntary treaty when he went and had a meeting with Austria. And there was another couple small countries he would meet with. And he basically, in private, told them, if you don't sign this treaty with me whereby you surrender to me all your national interests, we're going to invade you and destroy you. And so with great fear and trepidation, manipulation occurred and treaties were signed, and that was the basis for by which Hitler initially started to build his Third Reich, an abuse of the idea of conventional treaties. But of course those really weren't voluntary treaties at all. But the point here with a conventional treaty is a nation has no law over it. It doesn't have to answer to anyone unless it has voluntarily created a law by agreeing with another nation and binding itself to some form of duty. Then when that continues, then you have this understanding, well, what are the kind of conventional treaties that we ought to be involved in? George Washington, in his farewell address, made a significant statement concerning the idea of limited association. He said that treaty law must remain limited in scope and purpose to avoid interdependence and to maintain autonomy. He said if you have an enemy where you hate him too much, or a friend whom you love too much, in both cases you begin to put yourself in a position of interdependence whereby your mutual interest with another entity begins to control the well-being and the function of your own self. So limited association, no treaty ever ought to be a sweeping treaty of surrender of national interests, of national rights, of autonomy. Then the third principle is the principle of fidelity. That basically is, I do what I said I would do when I signed the treaty. So that when I obligate myself in some fashion by treaty, then that treaty obligation causes me, even at my own peril, to engage with the one I've signed a treaty with in that venture. So obviously fidelity implies carefulness. You don't recklessly and limited association is much more significant if you're going to have to keep your word. One of the things that was said about the white man by the American Indian was that every treaty we ever made with the Indians, we broke. And of course, wherever that has been true, that's a case of breach of fidelity, which is bound basically in the courts of God. The remedy for breach of fidelity is only warfare. And in American history, the Indians would rise up in warfare, and then we eventually defeated them militarily, and so we escaped the penalty for failure to be faithful to our vow by crushing our enemy. And then the last point here with regards to conventional treaties is interposing. There's a difference between interfering and interposing. A nation interposes, such as Abraham did with the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, etc., when he came to the aid of another sovereign and was oppressed by any tyrant. Okay, so his brother-in-law Lot and his family unit, which was dwelling in Sodom and Gomorrah, he was oppressed by these 5 kings that came and did battle with them, and the consequence was there was the need for Abraham to come to an aid. So this is the idea of interposing. So I have jurisdiction to come to the aid of another by treaty. That's the first part. If I make an agreement, I'll come to your assistance. If somebody comes after you, we make that treaty. Or if there's threat of injury to my own sovereign interests. And of course, that is a little bit more difficult to define, because what may be my view of my own sovereign interests might be another's perfect right by view of their sovereign interests, which of course many wars have been fought attempting to resolve those issues. Using these ideas of the law of nations, someone might say, well, was it appropriate for the United States to gain independence primarily by the help of the French in delivering us from the scourge of the British? And there's a lot of discussion that can handle in that, but it does bring us to just a little bit bigger picture of the difference between a weak nation and a nation of need. And essentially what French did, which is actually what the British was doing with the South during the war between the states, they were waiting for some evidence, for some manifestation of proof that this so-called new sovereign nation had any capacity at all to actually perform and function as a nation. And so it was not until after the Winter of Valley Forge, it was not until after the major battles in the north, in York, that was won by Washington. It was not until these victories were secured that the French discovered, well, there's reason to acknowledge the potential of this sovereign nation to stand alone. And so they came to our assistance by treaty, but we were not their puppet, as it were. We were their, they were invited by treaty into our affairs, and they helped us. With respects to the Civil War, the British never were certain that the South had managed to demonstrate significant autonomy, the significant capability of standing alone as a nation. And so while they watched it with measured question on the sidelines, the South never manifested that strength, and so the British never came to aid of arms. Those are always calls of question and conscience. Probably a more colorful illustration in American history is the story of Texas. One of our famous military generals, Andrew Jackson, was president during the time, and the Mexican government owned all of the territory of Texas, and the Mexican government made an offer to people in general that you could migrate to the Texas territory, and if you followed certain responsibility and filed your paperwork in a sufficient fashion, you could own property and live and serve and grow your own crops, etc., on the ranch that you created. And thus Texas was filled not with so much Mexicans. About 80% of the Texas population were Americans looking to start farms and start their own ranches, etc. And about 20% of the population was Mexicans. But then when Santa Anna came to power, he decided that he was going to break the treaty with all of those property holders. And he simply said, thank you for farming my land. I declare this land is mine, and you must give me all your crops. And basically he swiped the land from the people. Well, the Americans, 80% of the population of Texas was Americans. The Americans, being Americans, thought, well, let's go get help from Uncle Sam. So they went to Andrew Jackson and they said, hey, could you help us fight Santa Anna? He's stealing our lands. And Andrew Jackson, who knew the law of nations and our country's policy, said, I'm sorry, but you voluntarily went into a foreign country. You agreed to their agreements, and we have no jurisdiction. You're not a national entity. All we can say is if any of our fellow Americans want to help their fellow Americans recover their lost property, like Lot helped Sodom recover his lost property, the king of Sodom and his own brother Lot. So the fidelity between brothers can go. David Crockett drummed up a bunch of volunteers, and they went down, and you might remember the story of the Alamo as the first battle occurred, with Santa Anna defeating and annihilating that small troop at the Alamo. But the consequence of the kindness of Americans for their brothers stirred up enough volunteers that the volunteers won the right of freedom. They formed an independent nation by winning their rights from Santa Anna by war with no help of the United States. It was only after they broke away from Mexico by war that they formed their own independent government. And at that point in time, they requested to be annexed into the United States. They wanted to be one of the states of the United States of America. And they appealed again to Andrew Jackson, but now having won their liberty, having demonstrated that they deserved the right to be in the arena of world nations, they were considered an independent party. And as America began attempting to settle the dispute, as it were, they were in the process of accepting Texas as a state when Santa Anna came back saying, hey, you can be a separate nation, but you can't be a part of the United States. Santa Anna invaded again, but this time the United States had a lawful interest by treaty, and the United States forces entered into Texas and finished defeating Texas. But it's a little interesting thing. More of our American history from a foreign policy standpoint bridges out of this concept of the law of nations that came out of careful study of Scripture in the Reformation than perhaps we have ever known in terms of our own familiarity. We're going to talk about just cause for war. War must have a just cause and be justly conducted. Obviously, if the chief instrument of securing your rights is warfare, then you have to discuss war as a part of national interest. And so there's two elements here. You have to have a just cause, and you have to have a just conduct. Well, let's talk about the just cause first. Again, these are from Paul Jaley's tapes, and my encouragement is to listen to those tapes for a much more interesting and detailed presentation. But first of all, just cause for war means that injury to one's sovereign interests necessitates the redress of grievances, and that all other means of redress have been exhausted without success. War being the only just course left to regain one's sovereign rights. Again, that's the definition of a just war defined by the reformers around between the 13 to the 1500s. There are 5 subpoints to a just war that make a war just. I think in terms of the city of God, just war concept was first written by Augustine, so it goes back to 300 AD. First of all, a just war is a war of self-defense. It may encompass a preemptive strike, but it's primarily protecting national interests. A just war has to have the right intention. By right intention, it means that your specific intention is clear, the rights that you're hoping to defend are justly yours, and therefore you have a clear cause. With that clear cause comes the third point, clear goals. a just war has to have very specific goals that you're after. In recent history, probably one of the better ways of seeing the picture of just war is how President George Bush I conducted what we call the Gulf War. When he invaded Iraq to liberate Kuwait, he had very clear goals. The goals did not include capturing Baghdad and deposing Saddam Hussein. As a consequence, we limited, we controlled our objective. We had goals that we were after: liberating Kuwait and preserving the sovereignty of that national state and returning to them their clear sovereign rights. That was the goal, and so we stopped. The war stops when those goals are achieved. It took years later to come back under other pretenses of self-defense, right intention, and clear goals to engage in the Iraqi war that we're still engaged in today, which did depose Saddam Hussein. The fourth point here is advancing good. Now, of course, it begins to be a little bit subjective. Who's defining good? Because we tend to always define our interests as good, and so the idea here is good in the context of righteous before God. Now, obviously, I'm sure that much what's purported to be righteous before God is nothing more than a selfish, unrighteous motive of man. But nevertheless, as we would consider a just war, it ought to be a war that can advance good. And then it's also a war of last resort. In other words, there has been other means tried. Those means have not succeeded, and so as a last resort, you secure rights of people, etc., by the use of war, by the use of force. Again, even in our recent entry into Iraq, the good illustration is that in the United Nations, from the time of George Bush I to the time of the final invasion of Iraq 4 years ago, we had 12 years of national scrutiny of certain interests and good for the whole world at large. And the other means that were deployed over those 12 years failed to bring resolution to the matters by which those goals we finally invaded Iraq for. In terms of the complaining and the social debate that has taken place concerning this war, it's interesting to note that everyone, including all the liberals, agreed with the just war concept when we went in. Now, as the years have worn on, the concept of was it a just war is certainly being used as a political football. One of the things that is drawing most attention to it, though, is the claim of WMDs, as they call it. That was the right intention for going in. The failure to find large caches of that seemed to shine a light of, well, maybe we didn't have the right intention because we didn't have the right intelligence. Not to acknowledge that in 12 years, with plenty of photography, it's known that a lot of this technology was shipped out to Syria, and the Soviet Union took back a lot of their stuff. Not to deny those aspects. At the same time, it's important to recognize that even though you might hate the political debate, at least you can see the reflection that our debate today, even in our press and our Congress about the war in Iraq, is being argued along the structure still of what Augustine set forth and what Western Christian civilization deems as ideals relating to a just war. Now, the next idea is the just conduct of war. In other words, war has to have the least damage to life and property and is done in the prosecuting of the war. There are 7 areas here, I believe, that also come out of Augustine's City of God. You don't start a war unless you have a reasonable hope of success. Again, that's one, again, of the evidences that the French had, why they joined helping the United States to win our freedom, because we gave evidence of reasonable hope of success, so we earned our right as national sovereignty in their eyes, and by their coming to our assistance, our success could be secured. As little life lost as possible. Now, that's an obvious statement. It's a Christian principle of war, and when you look at the the Islamic military policies, you need to recognize one thing, They hold not at all to the Christian principles of a just war or a just conduct of war laid forth in Western civilization. What you need to understand is our culture for 2,000 years has been blessed by a Christian view of national governmental interests, so that as terrible as war is, we have bound ourselves to these rules for the sake of respect. That's how you find in the middle of World War I, the German and the French troops pulled up a white flag on Christmas Eve, went out into no man's land, and celebrated Christmas, remembering the Savior, because their primary commitment as people, first and foremost, were to God. So this whole concept of as little life lost as possible points to the fact that the objective of war is what you're trying to reach. The objective of war always is righting a wrong, returning back a sovereign interest to yourself that is being attempted to be taken away. But there's always, for the Christian, this larger remembrance that the lives of other people are not chattel by which I can be reckless with. Now, the question of as little life lost as possible, though, does cast a shadow. It may be of an interest for you to have a debate sometime, even if it's just with yourself. You know, was the United States, was it the right decision for the United States to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, those two cities? The significance of dropping the bomb in Japan was that it ended the war. The basis for it was this concept here of as little life as possible. It must be admitted, though, that the determined objective of as little life lost as possible was precisely focused on the United States and the Allied forces losing as little life as possible there. The losses that we incurred in those sea battles with the Japanese were so enormous that the capacity to win the freedom to deter the enemy, we saw a tremendous amount of potential of bloodshed, of Allied blood. And so it was the goal to lose as little life as possible, but we were singularly focusing on our own. Generally speaking, this just war concept of as little life lost as possible extends to your adversaries, and it extends to point D, non-combatant immunity. In other words, you're not fighting citizens. The great crime of 9/11 and the Islamic militant terrorism is that they're actually not conducting warfare. They're attacking common citizens as an attempt to terrorize, to gain their rights or to gain their interests by blatant ignoring of the rights of individual people. So World War II put us in a point of jeopardy nationally because there was a great deal. It can be said the Germans violated these principles. It can be said the Japanese violated these principles. And so in the larger contest, the question is out there, should we, because millions of lives were lost of Japanese, the dropping of the bomb. But not only was it millions of lives, they were non-combatants. They were the ordinary citizens. Yes, the United States attempted to lose as little life as possible. We bombed those two cities for about a week ahead of time. Each time we dropped the bomb, we bombed them first with leaflets explaining that we were going to drop a bomb that would destroy the whole city, leave and flee for your life because we were going to destroy the city. Nobody responded because nobody believed what the track said, but at the same time, there is at least a shadow of violating of this.
Weren't they attempting to bomb the military, but they missed, or they were misinformed about where the military installments were?
The question was, weren't they bomb military installations? I do know this much. I can't answer your question specifically. I do know that they chose cities that would have the least amount of loss of life possible. They chose it in a fashion to make a statement with the least destruction. That it was potentially a place of military production may also be true, but nonetheless, it was very understandable. It was very understood by American decision makers that the bomb was going to destroy everything in its path, and which it did. But again, these are the kinds of issues Christians themselves through the ages. And today in the modern world, especially with the Islamics, you don't expect the Islamics to follow these rules. But here's that whole picture of the deliverance and the vitality that Christ brings to life when we begin to live as God would have us live. We respect others, and it's an interesting process. We have more respect for the Islamics and their murderous schemes against us than they have for our ordinary and innocent citizens. Last 3 points. Don't demoralize through death. Again, the claim against the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki center primarily around the idea that we demoralized the Japanese through death, this widespread death. It's true, these 2 bombs stopped the war immediately. The Japanese were in no way prepared to surrender their home ground. An invasion of Japan was going to be of an enormous price. But the concept of just killing people, again, it's not a Christian concept. Nations don't have the authority to just murder people like the communists have, like the Russians and the Japanese and the Chinese have, annihilating hordes and hordes of people just for a military or a personal point of view or interest. Proportionate use of force sort of is a consequence of the prior 4 ideas. Proportionate use of force means you secure your right only with the force needed to secure it. And again, it means that you limit the scope of your invasion and your size and the nature of the occupying troops just to achieve the agenda that you have in mind. The United States, in the conduct of this Iraqi war, demonstrated an incredible picture of proportionate use of force. In the early days of the wars, all the generals were complaining that Bush was being reckless because we sent such a small army over there. There's just no way that we could conduct the war and win it with such a tiny little military. But with the context of American forces, the intellectual, or excuse me, the technological capabilities that were a part of that invasion, really the whole world was stunned because we had a sufficient force to get the job done in an extremely short amount of time. It was the shortest war in modern history, with the least amount of death, but a good picture of proportionate use of force. There is question that maybe we should have had more troops over there to occupy, to secure the terrorist cells, and that's what this recent surge, so-called surge, is going on today as we speak. And then finally, war crimes are judged by a civilian tribunal versus a governmental or a military tribunal. And I think that is probably the one thing World War II departed from. The military tribunal set up by Russia, Britain, and the United States to judge the war crimes of Japan and the Germans certainly violated this concept. And actually, believe it or not, some of the discussion and debate over the manner of conduct of the prisoners of war down at Gitmo, et cetera, stems from some of this discussion. So it's interesting to see here, in terms of the just war concept, just conduct of war, we have a Christian principle established since 300 AD by thoughtful Christians who are respecting God's intention with national sovereigns and the necessity of national sovereigns to respect each other in the discourse of human events. And it's an amazing thing to reflect that nearly 2,000 years of Western history have been so significantly cared for and protected, so that as horrible as war has been and as significant as the war has been over the years, we found an incredible amount of controlled and deliberate consideration coloring war with the Christian perspective. At this point, I'm going to have to stop the discussion because of time. How much time do I have left? 15 minutes? Okay. Well, did you stop it? Okay. I'll keep going a little bit. I don't want to, I'm not going to get real far here, but I'd like to go through the, a couple of the other pictures here of Abraham. And I'd like to talk about the problems, and we can get through the whole list of problems in the 15 minutes before we close for the break, so for the end of this class. Beginning with Abraham, The issue between man and God is righteousness. And we spent a great deal of time in the first hour this morning, so I won't spend any more time on that. But that's going to be the recurring problem theme that we discuss through these national histories. Every nation is given over to idolatry. Again, Abraham's own family worshiped false gods. So satisfaction of God's righteousness is the theme of history, and it has a personal as well as a national theme in the conduct of histories of the earth. Abraham becomes the father of many nations, first by physical birth to many children, and second by modeling faith as the means to entering the family of God. So the problem of righteousness prepared by God through faith in his promises is the problem from Adam through Antichrist. And so this is going to be the one problem that we reflect on continuously as we finish the studies of world history. So at this point then, we move on to Jacob and Moses, and this is where I'll end the lecture today, and we'll begin there next time. Thank you very much. Hope you didn't get worn out. Anybody have any questions that are